Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the panel for taking the time to be here. I think we've had a pretty evident case lined out, particularly the doctor had lined out some of the complex webs that we see in terms of being able to create shell corporations that are going to be able to seek financing. But part of the challenge, obviously, is when you get those smaller-sized corporations, we do get into the financial institutions that are facing some reputational risk, institutional risk when it comes to, frankly, funding illicit firearms and weapons with perhaps not even the knowledge that they're actually doing that. And Ms. Rosenberg, if you maybe speak to, really here in the U.S. we have a pretty robust system to be able to identify and counter some of the illicit finance that does go on. But when it comes to our smaller financial institutions, do you believe that there's an actual awareness that exists in some of the contemporary realities that we really face with the proliferation finance and the threats that they have?
It's certainly true that the biggest institutions in the United States, or I should start by saying the United States is best in class when it comes to identifying potential proliferation activities, to analyzing this, to taking law enforcement or sanctions action. That said, it's not enough. We still witness a North Korean nuclear program that is very dangerous and scary, so we must do more, even if the United States is best in class. And there's a few institutions that sit atop that best-in-class status. Some of the major U.S. global banks, financial institutions, and corporations are excellent they have their own financial intelligence units, able to try and proactively look for patterns of proliferation and communicate that directly to our law enforcement community. We are in their debt, those two constituencies. However, these smaller companies that you've mentioned, or financial institutions, regional credit unions, we have seen in a number of instances they don't have the staff, the awareness, the compliance culture to recognize when certain kinds of financial abuse comes through their system. However, not all of them have direct international relationships, for example. They must go through some of these bigger money center banks in order to conduct that. That becomes a kind of a check on their activities, but it's really up to the federal and state level banking supervisors and regulators to help them to understand and to follow the law such as it is and to identify and stop that proliferation activity where it may occur and affect them.
Do you have some direct suggestions along those lines? You know, you'd spoken a little bit to transparency, obviously. We understand certainly some of the correspondent banking connectivity that's going to be there, but just being able, some actions that the smaller institutions institutionally could take, or is it simply a matter of scale, size, and dollars?
And understanding risk. So the United States has a risk-based approach to its financial supervision. And the Fed, the OCC, that oversee the biggest financial institutions and those they supervise have a rock-solid understanding of what that looks like. But risk is different for different institutions. Of course, there are smaller regional banks in the United States that have much broader exposure to Latin America, for example. So even while they're not those biggest money center banks, if they should have a good sense of their risk, who is coming to Miami? Who is placing structured transactions in the United States and buying anonymously real estate in that market? If they understand their risk well, and that is up to their regulators at the state level and at the federal level to help them calibrate their risk appropriately, that's something that we should, that's a banner we should raise and say, understand the particular risk you have with your footprint and your orientation for your financial activities. It's different for every financial institution.
Would you maybe share with us a couple of your thoughts on just focus a little bit on the SARS reports and that American banks are required to be able to submit to FinCEN? And do you think that we have sufficient information about how the SARS reports are used by law enforcement to be able to combat proliferation financing?
Do you have sufficient information? Well, I don't know what kind of briefings that FinCEN gives to you. I would encourage you to have a full and frank conversation with them. It's not just them because they administer the BSA and collect it. And I think any law enforcement officer looking at terrorism finance or proliferation finance might take issue that these SARS are FinCEN SARS. They belong to the entire law enforcement and intelligence community, and they should be so empowered to have access to them and to use them jointly.
This
add
can
one
probably
thing?
just be yes or no, but do you think it'd be helpful to know more about what kinds of suspicious activity reports, what they use the actions for when the reports are made?
Yes, on proliferation finance, because it will signal to them that you care. It will give a demand signal to them and the financial institutions that they oversee that must submit the SARs to know that this is a priority that they must look for and take action on.
Great. Thank you. My time's expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.